Hi everyone, welcome back for part 2 of muscles. Today's study tip is to do weekly reviews. And I'm trusting you that you're studying the current material each week, right? You post these lectures and that you're studying the current chapters that are assigned. But also make some time to look over the chapters from previous weeks. You can start at the beginning of the unit and look through those relevant chapters. This will help you when you get prepared for your exam that you are accumulating all this information. And lastly, study from the areas of weakness from Unit 1 and get stronger, right? So we're going to be getting our exams back soon. You'll be able to see what the first material gave you. And so then you can study the parts that you were weaker on and get better. So now we're in Chapter 12. We're talking about the muscular system. This is the second lecture of Chapter 12. And we're going to talk a lot about biomechanics today and the actual contraction of these muscles, okay? So we talked about sort of the molecular and anatomy last time and the contractile unit, and now we're going to talk about whole muscle contraction. So a muscle fiber is either on or off during a contraction. And the strength of a muscle contraction, the tension, depends on the number of cross bridges. So remember, the myosin heads are going to bind to the actin, and the number of myosin heads binding, the number of cross bridges, is going to confer strength in that muscle. So to increase tension or strength of contraction, a muscle has to recruit more fibers. And we talk about these in terms of motor units. Motor units being one motor neuron and the fibers that it commands. So when you're sending signals from your brain out to your muscles, you'll have one motor neuron attached to the fibers it commands as a motor unit. And you can recruit multiple motor units to do things like increase strength. Okay. So talk about fine motor control. We're talking about a high ratio, something like 1 neuron to 10 fibers. Comparing this to gross motor control has a lower ratio, about 1 neuron to 1,000 fibers. Okay. And so you need this finer, higher ratio in order to be able to do things like write and draw and have that fine motor control. Okay, so here's a picture of this motor unit, the motor neuron and the muscle fibers it innervates. Okay, here's a somatic motor neuron, and you can see that it's innervating multiple muscle fibers. So together, that motor neuron and this muscle is considered a motor unit. Okay, here's a second motor unit. When we think about a muscle anatomy, we might talk about this muscle as being a bicep, right? And that bicep then is differentially controlled by these different motor neurons. Okay, so you might have what appears to be one muscle with multiple motor units that recruit different parts of this muscle. Okay. And so the motor unit is going to include the neuron and the muscle itself, right? And remember those neuromuscular junctions, right? Those synapses where the nerve is going to actually meet or get really close to the muscle to be able to control the skeletal muscle fiber contraction. Okay, so we can think about strength and muscle contraction, and we can also think about fatigue. We talked a little about fatigue last time, and we think a lot about how to prevent fatigue in our muscles. So to prevent fatigue, we have asynchronous recruitment of motor units. So that means that at some times, some fibers are on and others are off. During maximal tension, all the motor units are working. And this is where these amazing stories of strength, right? Where someone might lift a car off their friend. That can happen because sometimes you can get this maximal tension where you're recruiting all the motor units. Okay. So in order to fire muscles, we need ATP, mostly for detachment of myosin from actin, right? So that's what the ATP is doing. It's allowing detachment. Okay. There's also a calcium ATPase that pumps calcium back into the SR. So remember that you're going to release calcium from the SR in order to contract muscles. And this ATPase then pumps calcium back into the SR so that you can then contract your muscles again. So about 75% of ATP is wasted as heat. And this is just the nature of work and the nature of biology, is that a lot of the energy in this case is lost as heat. So where does ATP come from? ATP comes from rest. During rest, extra ATP is converted to create creatine phosphate. Okay, and during contraction, the P, the phosphate from creatine phosphate, is added to ADP to make ATP. ATP and creatine phosphate give energy for about 30 seconds. So to make more than 30 seconds worth of ATP, we need mitochondria. So that's where the bulk of our ATP is going to come from, is the mitochondria completing cell respiration. Okay. So let's think about this stimuli from the brain to muscles and how this might work. We talked about summation in the nervous system, right, where we mentioned that you can have temporal summation on a neuron from presynaptic cells. But now this summation is talking about it in terms of muscles. Okay, so first we got to remind ourselves what a twitch is. A muscle twitch is when the muscle is stimulated with a single electric shock of sufficient voltage. It quickly contracts and releases. In summation, if a second electrical shock is delivered before the muscle has a chance to fully relax from the first twitch, the second twitch will ride piggyback on the first. Okay, so here we are, and so this is measuring this muscle twitch here. Okay, so here's our first twitch, and we get a second stimulus before this one comes all the way back down and gives a second higher twitch then. Okay, so this is muscle summation. So I want you to compare this kind of summation versus the temporal summation we discussed in the nervous system. Okay, so remember tetanus? We talked about incomplete and complete tetanus last time, and now we're going to talk about fatigue. Okay, so here's incomplete tetanus, 5 shocks per second, 10 shocks per second, 60 shocks per second, giving us complete tetanus, and then eventually fatigue of the muscle. Right? Okay. So when we're going to use all motor units to produce maximum force, at some point there's going to be fatigue. Okay. And we get accumulation of extracellular potassium, but a brief 1-minute rest will restore this. Okay, so we can get motor accumulation, all motor units in use, and fatigue, but then you can restore that pretty quickly. For longer fatigue, though, it's because of an accumulation of PO4 from breakdown of phosphocreatine or due to loss of glycogen. Okay. When this happens, loss of glycogen, you get a decrease in calcium release from the SR, but we don't know why. We don't know the mechanism of how that works. We just know that when you have a loss of glycogen, you get this decrease in calcium. And longer fatigue can also happen because of a decline in ATP. Okay, so you can have multiple ways in which you get longer lasting fatigue in muscles. Okay. So we're going to compare physical conditioning now. We're going to compare anaerobic endurance versus aerobic endurance. You might have heard about aerobic exercise, right? And that's this aerobic endurance piece where you have an oxygen debt, okay, and you increase the number of capillaries to muscle. In anaerobic endurance, for things like sprinting or weightlifting, we get enlargement of muscles. So as you do more anaerobic exercise, the muscles enlarge, you get more myofibrils, and eventually hypertrophy. So how this works is that when you are doing things like lifting weights, you're creating micro tears in the muscle, and as the body repairs those micro tears, it makes more myofibrils, which overall enlarges the muscle. Okay. Aerobic exercise creates an oxygen debt. So you're not increasing the number of myofibrils then to increase muscle size, but you are able to increase the number of capillaries to muscle, which makes you better able to oxygenate your muscles and then do things like run, swim, that sort of aerobic activity. Okay, let's think about this example. Philip is a thin, tall 29-year-old man. He wants to get bigger muscles, most likely due to societal influences on the physique of men. And the health food store he shops at has recommended 2 diet supplements for his diet, creatine and protein powder. So I want you to think about these things and read about them and describe why these products sound like they would boost their bodybuilding. But then think about physiologically why this wouldn't work. Why is Philip actually wasting his money? Okay. So during contraction, we have 2 different kinds of forces in contraction. There's the active force of the myosin actin bind that makes the power stroke. And this is normally the only force used in a muscle. Sometimes, though, we have passive force, which is a stretchy behavior of muscles, tendons, and connective tissue. And this is actually mostly seen experimentally. So we don't see it a whole lot in sort of natural conditions, but it's something that you can make muscles do when you have them in the lab. Okay. And so using your textbook, I want you to write the definitions for these following terms, particularly looking at figure 12.20, okay? So use this figure to help relate velocity of shortening to force. So first, define isotonic contraction and isometric contraction. And then, if you can either do this or think about it. If you're holding your heavy backpack or book at a 90-degree angle and you lift it towards your shoulder, which maneuver is isotonic and which is isometric? Okay. So here's something about this length-tension relationship in muscle. And you can look at, when we look at percentage of rest length, okay, you get maximum tension at between 100 and 120% of rest length. Okay, so from 60%, relative tension increases as percentage rest length increases, but post 120 or so, that relative tension comes back down again too. So being um, much longer then is not going to be good for tension. Okay. So when the muscles are too short, you get a lot of overlap of the myosin and actin. If it's too long, the myosin heads do not have access to the actin. Right, so this is why too short or too long muscles, you get less tension ability. So the optimal length of a muscle for tension purposes gives maximum force, and all myosin heads can interact with the actin. So remember that your muscles are not actually growing during exercise. Exercise is the stimulus, right? That's then going to cause muscle growth in certain cases. The body then actually strengthens the muscles while you're resting. And so this is really important, is that rest is just as important as the activity you're doing. And we know this from elite athletes too, is that not enough rest time will not get you the gains you're seeking because you're not allowing this repair that's going to eventually strengthen and grow muscles. Okay, so finally we're going to talk about muscle fiber types today. We'll talk about two types, fast twitch fibers and slow twitch fibers. The fast twitch ones are larger in diameter, they're thicker. And the slow twitch ones are much smaller, half the size of the fast twitch fibers. In the fast twitch, we have a really high density of myofibrils, whereas the slow twitch ones, we actually have more capillaries. Okay, so more of a blood supply to slow twitch. And so these fast twitch ones are really powerful with lots of sarcomeres, whereas the slow twitch ones have myoglobin. So myoglobin is going to be a molecule that, like hemoglobin, binds oxygen. In this case, it's binding oxygen in your muscles. So we're already starting to see the differences here, right? Fast twitch fibers are focused on powerful, fast contractions, thick muscles, thick diameter. Slow twitch fibers are focused on oxygen, right? More capillaries and a bigger ability to bind oxygen with myoglobin. Fast twitch fibers are white in color. Slow twitch are red. And so this trade-off, the trade-off here between the power associated with fast twitch and quick fatigue. So yes, fast twitch fibers are really strong, powerful contraction, but they fatigue quickly. Compare this to slow twitch fibers. They're not as powerful as fast twitch. They're half the size of fast twitch, but you can get long sustained contractions because of this oxygen carrying capacity here. Okay, and so commonly in different types of athletes, we see these differences is that sprinters tend to have more fast twitch fiber muscles, while endurance runners are have more of the slow twitch fibers. Okay, so again, we see this muscle composition changing with different kinds of athletic activity. So here's our sprinter. with lots of the fast twitch fibers. Here's our long distance runner with a lot of the slow twitch fibers, and then people that do middle distance running are going to see some combination thereof. Okay? And so next time you exercise, think about your muscle contractions and think about some of this activity you might be doing that might be changing your muscle physiology. I'll see you next time.